November of 2023 will mark the 60th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Many historians agree that this event was a turning point in American history, a shocking event that began to sow the seeds of mistrust between the American people and their government. So why does this mistrust exist? Well, for starters, the government, through the Warren Commission, tells us that a lone gunman by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed President Kennedy on that fateful day in Dallas, Texas, and that he acted alone. But in the late 1970s, a special committee on assassinations in the House of Representatives came to the conclusion that Oswald probably killed President Kennedy, but they didn't believe he acted alone, and they believed that he was a part of a bigger conspiracy. Now, 60 years later, nearly 70% of Americans don't believe in the findings of the Warren Commission. They believe that a conspiracy theory looms behind the Kennedy assassination. What do I believe? Does that really fucking matter? I make videos for TikTok. What's up, guys? This is Corey, the CEO of History from TikTok, and today we are going to be counting down the top 6 biggest conspiracy theories behind the Kennedy assassination. You've probably heard of a lot of these conspiracy theories. Some of them may be fairly new to you, and I don't believe in all of these conspiracy theories, but I want to go into detail about them. Now, at the end of each conspiracy theory, I'm going to rank it on a scale from 1 to 10. If I rank it close to 10, that means I believe that this conspiracy theory could be possibly true. If it's closer to 1, then I don't really believe in this conspiracy theory at all. Okay, let's start off with the number 6 conspiracy theory. Coming in at number 6 on our list, the Soviet Union killed President Kennedy. So with all of these conspiracy theories, we're going to look at motive. What motive does the Soviet Union have to kill President Kennedy? Well, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union was engaged in the Cold War at that time. And the United States was the Soviet Union's biggest competitor and its biggest enemy. So the Soviet Union doesn't need some giant motive in order to be motivated to kill the president of their enemy country, right? They could just do it because he's the president of their enemy country. The Cuban Missile Crisis that occurred just a year earlier from the assassination was the closest that the Soviet Union and the United States came to actual open warfare. So the Soviet Union could have conspired to assassinate Kennedy just based off the grievances from that event. And we also know that Lee Harvey Oswald spent a significant amount of time in the Soviet Union before the assassination took place. He actually even married a Russian woman. So there's been a lot of conspiracy theories thinking that Lee Harvey Oswald was somehow triggered by the Soviet Union into committing the assassination. Although all of our research tells us that someone like Oswald would not have been chosen by the Soviet Union to carry out such a mission. The problem with the idea that the Soviet Union killed Kennedy is Kennedy was not the most anti-communist politician in America at that time. In fact, he was actually criticized by a lot of people here in the United States because he wasn't harder on communism. The Soviets definitely had spies operating in the United States at that time, and those spies may have not known all of what I'm about to say, but they probably knew some of it. That Kennedy was actually a lot softer on the Soviet Union than many of the people in his circle wanted him to be. There are a lot of reports that Kennedy was thinking about winding down our involvement in the Vietnam War, and that he was possibly thinking of collaborating with the Soviet Union to go to the moon rather than competing against them in the space race. All of that said, if the Soviet Union had any inclination that Kennedy was thinking of these things, why would they assassinate someone that would be easier for them to work with? It just doesn't make any sense. So with that being said, I'm going to give this conspiracy theory on a scale from 1 to 10 a 2. I really don't think the Soviet Union had anything to do with President Kennedy's assassination. However, anything is possible, so that's the reason why I put this conspiracy theory on the list, because I wanted to put it out there, but I don't really think it has a whole lot of truth to it. The number 5 conspiracy theory behind Kennedy's assassination is the KKK or some other white supremacy organization killed Kennedy. Now, this is a conspiracy theory that doesn't get talked about a whole lot in relation to the Kennedy assassination because it's just really unlikely, but I actually think it's a little bit more likely than the Soviet Union killing Kennedy, which is why I put it at number 5 on this top 6 list. What's the motives here? Well, Kennedy was, of course, a Democrat. And if you know anything about history, then you know that at the time, most racist Southerners who were politicians were mostly in the Democratic Party, if not entirely in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was the party of the South at this time. However, Kennedy was a reflection of the changes that were going on in the Democratic Party on a national level. Kennedy was from Massachusetts, and he was a big-time liberal, a big-time progressive, even by today's standards. And by 1963, it seemed like Kennedy was becoming more and more willing to be open to civil rights for African Americans. Now, Kennedy did not campaign on civil rights for African Americans. Obviously, that would have been political suicide as a Democrat. But after the March on Washington led by Martin Luther King Jr. in August of 1963, Kennedy seemed very willing to use the powers of the federal government to push forth equality and civil rights for African Americans. The Civil Rights Act that would end up going into law in 1964 was already floating around Congress while Kennedy was still alive, and all signals point to the fact that Kennedy was supportive of that bill and would not have vetoed it. So what the KKK or some other white supremacy group might be thinking is, hey, Johnson, the vice president, is a good old boy, a Southern Democrat from Texas, which just so happens to be the state that Kennedy was killed in. And maybe if he was president, he would actually stop all this civil rights nonsense that was going on in the Congress. At least that's what they thought it was, nonsense. Now, obviously, that would be a horrible gambit on their parts, because Lyndon B Johnson not only went on to support both the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, he also went on to do more for African Americans than any other president before him, other than maybe Abraham Lincoln, and definitely any other president since, and that includes Obama. Now, the things that Johnson did with his social safety nets and the Great Society policies may be seen as questionable by today's standards. There's a lot of debate even going on in the African American community about whether or not those things like, welfare, food stamps, public housing were actually good things for African Americans in the long term, but that's a totally different conversation for a totally different video, a video I will be making, by the way. But either way, the Southern racists at that time may have thought that Johnson was on their side, and that could be their motivation for wanting to kill Kennedy in order to elevate Johnson to the presidency. And the fact that Kennedy was assassinated in the South does bring a little bit more credence to this particular theory. However, personally, I just don't buy it. There's no strong evidence to suggest that the KKK or any white supremacy organization was involved in Kennedy's assassination. It just doesn't seem likely, and honestly, and this may just be my own personal bias, I just don't think they would have been smart enough to pull it off. But hey, anything is possible, so I put it on the list, but on a scale from 1 to 10, I'm going to give this conspiracy theory a 2.5 out of 10. The number 4 conspiracy theory on our list is that Vice President Lyndon B Johnson had something to do with Kennedy's assassination. Now, the motive here is pretty clear from a lot of different angles. First of all, Johnson and Kennedy didn't really get along with each other. Kennedy chose Johnson to balance the ticket in order to become president. He chose Johnson because Johnson was from the South, he was older, and a little bit more conservative than he was. But the two of them never really saw eye to eye when it came to policy. As we stated earlier in this video, Kennedy was thinking about pulling out of Vietnam, something that Johnson was dead set against. As we saw when he became president, Johnson greatly escalated American involvement in Vietnam. And there's also all these rumors about Johnson's wife owning stock in the Bell Helicopter Company, a company that provided a lot of helicopters to the war support in Vietnam. And it actually would have been a financial loss to Johnson for us to pull out of Vietnam. And of course, when money's involved, that's more than enough of a motive for him to kill Kennedy to keep that war going. But of course, one of the biggest motives here could just be raw political ambition. Johnson was an older man. Okay, and he wasn't in great health even when Kennedy was alive. He could have thought, well, if Kennedy gets 2 terms, I might not be able to run for a full term in 1968. So let me just kill him, get him out the way so I can become president now. Some real House of Cards, Frank Underwood shit. The only problem with this theory is if Johnson was to kill Kennedy just so he could become president, that sets a very dangerous precedent going forward. What's to stop his vice president from doing that to him so they can become president? So I'm thinking a pragmatist like Johnson probably wouldn't have engaged in something like that. However, one thing I want to say about all of these conspiracy theories is that it may be that more than one of them is true, right? Johnson could have known and possibly participated in the assassination, while some of the other conspiracy theories on this list could also be true. However, I personally don't really think Johnson was involved. There have been several books written on this, so I'm going to give this conspiracy theory on a scale from 1 to 10 a 4. I think it is likely that he was involved, but not extremely likely. I'm still going to put it under 50% chance. But again, any of this stuff is possible when you're talking about these types of conspiracies. I actually may break this video up into a part 1, part 2 because it is running pretty long. So if you want to see part 2, like and subscribe to this page for more content like this.